Hang on. Okay, that thing keeps interrupting me, but I'm just going to keep on going like the professional I'm trying to be. I appreciate a lot of you might be thinking, well, who on earth is this guy? So I'll just take a moment to introduce myself, if I may. So my name is Richard Smith, and for precisely 1 year and 2 days now, I have been the head of environmental sustainability for the University of Manchester, which is a position I feel very privileged to have. I'm still very much learning about university culture, about procedures, about governance, and indeed about our university's environmental impact. You name it, I'm still learning about it. So if I do drop any clangers over the next 45 minutes, then I hope you'll bear with me. I'm not going to give you my biography, you'll be pleased to hear, but just so you know, prior to joining the university, I had a very similar role at the BBC, based in Salford, just down the way from us. And prior to that, I was a BBC journalist. In fact, I was a Home Affairs correspondent, which is a slightly posh name for crime reporter, really. And I appreciate you might think that sounds a bit of a strange journey to go from from a crime reporter to head of environment at the University of Manchester, but nonetheless, that's what I've done. And actually, I think that the roles are closer than you might imagine, but that's one for another time. So in terms of what I actually do, I lead a small but brilliant and very dedicated team, all of whom are as committed as I am to making sure that the university is a force for good environmentally. There are environmental aspects to everything, of course, that the university does. And our job is to try and work out what those impacts are, to measure them, and critically to do something about them. And that's what we do every minute when we're at work. There's so much I could tell you about what we're up to and what we hope to be doing. But today is very much about the zero carbon aspect, which we'll move on to in a moment. But I will say that we're currently working on a new environmental sustainability strategy, which will try to encompass everything that the university does in terms of its activity. First up, though, is honouring or trying to honour this commitment to achieving zero carbon by 2038. And that's what this session is about. So I think we can go on to the slides now. I don't know if are they already there, Harriet? Is it just that I can't see them? Oh, here we go.
So we're on to the Menti.
Yeah, that's right. So before we go any further, we have got one question for you. I don't know whether any of you have used this tool before called Menti. If not, you're going to use it now. It's dead simple. Even I can do it. So what I'd like you to do, please, just to get a bit of engagement going, is using whatever device you choose to use. Go to menti.com. Add in that code that you can see at the top there, which is 78413297. And you'll be confronted with this question, which says, what does zero carbon mean to you? So all we'd like you to do, please, is go to menti.com, add in that code that I've just mentioned, and answer that question. What does zero carbon mean to you? And hopefully a few short, sharp answers will start appearing on the screen any second now, and we can just have a look at them just to get a flavour of what you're interested in. Hope that makes sense. No emissions, no offsetting is number one. No emitting or producing carbon dioxide emissions. Electric cars, they're coming in thick and fast. This is what we like. Not going to read them all because I won't have time. Eliminating fossil fuel use, a future for my children. I'm sure we'll all agree with that one. Low emissions. I can't read the bottom of that one, but I think it says emissions brought to zero without relying on offsets. Renewable energy, saving the world. Putting more carbon back in the ground than is being produced. I'm going to end on this one rather than read them all out. A future for humanity. I mean, ultimately, that's what it is all about, at least for me. Thanks so much for taking part in them. We're going to look at all those answers, and we're going to have another one of these Menti sessions further on in the session. So thanks for that. So why are we all here today then, as a bit of scene setting? So hopefully you will be aware, I'm sure you will be if you're on this call, that we have a commitment to achieving zero carbon at the university by 2038. So how did that come about? So back in 2018, the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, he announced this target of 2038 for the city of Manchester, not GMCA, that's a slightly different kettle of fish. But he announced the target of 2038 for the city of Manchester. And critically, to say that we need to do that, to have zero emissions within the city's so-called carbon budget, more of which in a moment. So if you're not sure what that means, don't worry, I'll explain later on. Several large organisations across the city made the commitment to zero carbon 2038. And one of them was the University of Manchester, which it did in 2019. So we're now in the start of 2022. So needless to say, the clock is ticking and we need to crack on, which is what we're trying to do. Next slide, please, Harriet. Thank you. Okay, so this one looks a bit technical and fiendish. However, it might be very familiar to some of you, not at all familiar to others. So I'll try to explain, and bear with me if you think it's stating the obvious. A question we often get asked is, what is included in this target? So carbon accounting is basically split into 3 buckets of different carbon emissions, okay? And they're called scopes: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So in very simple terms, scope 1 are the carbon emissions that we burn directly ourselves. So that would be, for example, from the gas that comes through pipes into the buildings, and then we then burn that gas in boilers to generate heat. Another example of a scope 1 emission would be the fuel that's in our fleet vehicles. For the vehicles that are still fossil fuel powered, when we burn that fuel directly in the engine of the vehicle, it creates emissions, out it goes. So any direct emission is a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 is the electricity that we purchase. So in that case, the emissions aren't actually coming from our use of electricity literally inside the buildings, but obviously the electricity has to be generated from somewhere. So scope 2 are the emissions that are created through the generation of the electricity, which we then use in our buildings. And finally, scope 3 is basically everything else. That's from our investments to our stationery, our travel, food, furniture, numerous other things, all goes in that big scope 3 bucket. Now, critically for this session, our zero carbon target only covers scope 1 and scope 2. So those are what's called the direct emissions, if you like. It's not about the other indirect emissions through our purchasing, through procurement, and travel, all the other things that we do. So why is that, you might well be asking? Well, it's because scopes 1 and 2 are far more in our control than scope 3 as it currently stands. So we can decide what energy we use, where the energy comes from, how much we use to a certain extent. What we can't do at this current point is measure precisely all the other aspects of the carbon footprint of our entire supply chain and everything else that goes with it. It's far harder to do, and it's far harder to control. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be working on it, and we will be working on it. So at some point, I would imagine that we will have a scope 3 target as well. But what we're talking about specifically today is for scopes 1 and scopes 2. Next one, please, Harriet. So a little bit of scene setting, having established that we're essentially talking about the emissions that we burn directly ourselves, plus the electricity. This really comes down to the estate and the small number of fleet vehicles that we have. So you can see there a few facts and figures about the University of Manchester estate. I'm not going to read them all out. Suffice to say, our university estate is very, very big. In fact, I had a look at a report this morning. It's second only to Cambridge, University of Cambridge, in terms of size, and even then only just by a fraction. So we are a very, very big university. There's only a few that are as big as us, and we're right up there at number 2. Just to complicate things further, we have a wide range of different types of buildings. We have the classic historical buildings. We have new builds. We have average builds, if you like, that were built probably from the 70s onwards that are not going to be amazing in terms of energy efficiency. We have a few rural buildings. We have labs. We have buildings absolutely full of critical scientific equipment and experiments, which I can't begin to comprehend. All of these different buildings present their own challenges and require different solutions. And of course, while we do any of the things that we hope that we will be doing, we have to do that while keeping the university running. It's not like we have a blank slate. You know, we can't move out of the house for a week, get everybody in, get the plumbers in and get the decorators in and sort it all out and then move back in. It just doesn't work like that. So that's another part of the complex challenge that we have. That said, I'm quite sure that every industry on the planet will say that their situation is unique and challenging. So that doesn't take away the responsibility that we have, regardless of the complexity, to try to do something about it. Next one, please, Harriet. So we do have one thing perhaps that most other businesses don't have the luxury of having, and that is a crack team of climate scientists at the Tyndall Centre, and also an amazing array of academic expertise across the board, which we've really only just started tapping into now. That's everything from biodiversity to geothermal energy, 1,000,001 other things in between. So if you are an academic and you go, hang on a minute, he hasn't come and talked to me yet, it will simply be because I don't know who you are and I've not found you yet. If you want to talk to me, because you think you can help, then please do get in touch. And I think our email address might be in the chat box somewhere. So please don't be offended if we've not been in contact with you. It's just about capacity and reach and knowing that you're there. So I really hope we'll be able to continue to tap into the academic expertise wherever we can. In relation to the zero carbon target, it was the Tyndall Centre which set the original target for the city. And they also set this notion of a carbon budget. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but basically that means there's a set amount of carbon in the world that can be emitted before we go over the threshold that we want to achieve, which is 1.5 degrees of warming maximum around the world. And as a result of that, we know how much can be emitted by the city of Manchester, or at least we can estimate it, which is what Tyndall have done. And then we can come up with a figure that's related to the university itself. So we have two targets really, one to be zero carbon by 2038, and the other is within our carbon budget. And the carbon budget really is just meaning that we don't emit more than our fair share of the carbon that can still be emitted around the world to prevent that high level of warming that we also desperately want to avoid. So thanks obviously are very much due to the Tyndall Centre for the work they've done so far, both for the city and the university, and I'm sure we'll continue to work closely together. They provide the data and they keep us honest, which is great. Next one, please. Thanks, Harriet. So that's it from me. You'll be pleased to hear. I will take questions afterwards. We'll have another Menti session. But now we're going to hear from Dr. Sean Jones from Siemens. I've been working with Sean for several months now with other members of the team about how we can potentially go about tackling those carbon emissions. Sean's not going to talk about specifics today. We're not going to get into building level stuff or anything about how much it costs or anything like that. We're simply not at that stage yet. What Sean will do, though, is give you a flavour of the kind of options, the kind of solutions that might be available to us. It might be too technical for some of you. It probably may be not technical enough for others, but please bear with us. We'll try and kind of get a middle path that keeps everybody happy at least some of the time. So thanks for listening. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks for that intro, Richard. Yeah, very all-encompassing, very interesting stuff. So I'm a consultant and I work for Siemens, as Richard mentioned, and what we've been tasked with doing is taking that target that the university has committed to with the Tyndall Centre and trying to figure out what the university estate needs to do to become to meet that target, essentially. So we've gone through a whole host of different assessments and analysis of the campus to try and figure out what those specific interventions are and what the timeline is for implementation up to 2038. If you want to skip to the next slide, Harriet. So in essence, the master plan that we're developing in collaboration with the university looks at three really key aspects. So those are listed there in those coloured squares. The first place that we've started is with energy efficiency. So before we consider anything else, the first thing we need to do is understand how we can reduce our energy consumption as much as possible, because the emissions that we are tasked with reducing, so as Richard mentioned, scope 1 and 2, so the gas and the oil that you burn on site, but also the electricity that you use from the national grid, needs to be reduced as much as possible. So before you even think about decarbonising those sources, you need to bring your demand for energy right down. And as part of this, we've done a 3-year plan, but then also a further 2 extra phases for additional 3-year plans, which look at specific interventions within buildings. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail about those later. So once we've considered how you reduce your energy demand and hence your emissions, that's when we can start thinking about the energy that you do use, how you decarbonise it. So the second box there, the red one, heat. This is the big challenge for every sector, every industry. It's the most difficult energy vector to decarbonise by a long shot. And it isn't helped as well by the fact that our current heat source, current fuels like fossil fuels are relatively cheap. So what we've done is try to look at where you're getting your heat from. And for the University of Manchester, it is really predominantly gas boilers on site. There's less than 1% that comes from oil boilers. So it's very, very small, but gas boilers make up over 99% of your on-site emissions for heat. And then secondly, or thirdly rather, we look at energy procurement. So maybe energy procurement is a bit of a misleading term. This is about your grid electricity. So where you get that electrical supply from dictates the emissions that are associated with it. So in a perfect world, we would be able to generate all of the electrical demand for the campus on site with renewable energy. Because the University of Manchester is a campus university in the middle of a city with very limited roof space or land area for the installation of renewable energy projects, that means that we do as much as we can. So we install as much renewable energy as possible. That will be limited by the site constraints. So then we need to look at how we get our electricity supply. So that's going to come from the national infrastructure, which is the national grid and your local distribution network, which is unavoidable. But what you can influence is the source of that electricity. So the best way to do this is through an off-site renewable energy project. So if you imagine there'd be a wind farm somewhere, maybe in Scotland, where you can directly purchase and procure your energy. So you can account for it as being zero emissions. And in a nutshell, those are the three things that all need to come together for us to develop a zero carbon strategy and implementation plan that we're working on at the moment. Do you want to skip to the next slide, please, Harriet? So as Richard said, we're going to give you a high-level overview of some of the interventions that we're proposing or that might be available. These by no means are finalized yet, so these are just indications of the types of things that should be or will be going on the campus in future, at least in the next 3 years. So starting from the top then, we've got LED lighting. So this is a quick win. Updating your current lighting systems to be low energy demand. So you're reducing your energy demand in that regard. Another key thing that we've discovered from our site audits and surveying your different buildings is this baseload optimization requirement. So what that means is if you imagine your electricity demand, it will peak at different times of the day. So you imagine you come into the office, everybody goes for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, switch all the lights on, and your electricity demand will peak. What a base load is the demand that it's essentially the demand when there is no occupation of a building. So in theory, your base load should be very low during the night if there's no one in the buildings. But what we found is that your base load is actually quite high. So your energy demands are relatively high even when those buildings aren't being used. Now, this, in some cases, is a waste of energy and also affects the associated emissions. So the other intervention we're proposing is optimizing that, so reducing your energy when it's not needed. The third option there is Bms Upgrades. So BMS stands for Building Management Systems, and these are the systems that control the buildings themselves, so all the different aspects of the building. These are quite dated at the moment at the university, so an upgrade of these systems would significantly improve or reduce energy consumption, just because you're getting more access about what different equipment is consuming and you can control it better. And then the final part of this slide is building fabric retrofits. So the UK, we've got a big issue with our building fabric and the state of our current building stock. A lot of our buildings were built, well before the year 2000, and as a result, they don't perform as well as they should, or by modern standards at least. So, in order to remedy that, what we can do, and some of the things that we'll propose in the master plan, is renovating those buildings. So changing the effective wall insulation, changing windows so that there's less air leakage, insulating roofs and ceiling cavities, that kind of thing. Next slide, please, Harriet. So yeah, as I mentioned, we think about demand, how to reduce it, and then we start thinking about the energy that we do use, how we can decarbonize that. So again, the big issue throughout most of the UK's building stock and at the University of Manchester is the use of gas boilers. Gas boilers are cheap to run, and they're pretty standard practice, and they have been for decades now. But in order to decarbonize, we need to move away completely from those kind of assets and those kind of equipments. So there are a couple of solutions that will be proposed. One of those is heat pumps. This is something you might have heard about in the press recently, various announcements by government trying to promote the use of heat pumps. But essentially what a heat pump is like a refrigerator, but it operates backwards. So it uses a heat source like the air outside, and then elevates the temperature of that heat source and the heat, and then heats the inside of a building. And these are electrically powered, so they don't use fossil fuels to run. And the fact that they're run by electricity means we can use renewable sources for that. So that's one option. And the other one that we have floated, and we're exploring at the moment, and there are no certainties yet, is potentially deep geothermal. So there's some indication that there is a geothermal resource that could be accessible below the campus. And some of the academics at the university at the moment are exploring this to understand whether that's going to be a feasible source of heat for buildings. Next slide, please, Harriet. And then finally, again, energy procurement. So what does this mean? It's the electricity you buy from the grid, just like in your own home where you get an electricity bill every month or quarterly or every half year. It's the same for the university. You have a grid connection that where you receive most of your electricity from. So in order to decarbonize that grid connected electricity, what you can do is purchase something called a power purchase agreement. And this is essentially just a contract that says you are receiving the electricity that you use from a renewable generation project. So the two images there show you a wind farm and also a solar farm. So those are the type of projects where you'll be receiving electricity from, green electricity from. Next slide, please, Harriet.
Thanks, Sean. So now we're going to head back over to Menti, and we've got one other question for you, and then we will have some time for question and answer back to Richard and Sean. So let me head back and on to our next question. So I'm not sure if my bar that I'm seeing is blocking the top. Can you see the Menti code at the top?
Yes, I can see it, Harriet. It's
perfect. I've got my little bar.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so the question here is, why is a zero carbon campus important to you? That is assuming that it is important. Feel free, if you don't think it is, you could chuck in your thoughts here, but since we're all here, chances are you are interested. Great, first one, I don't want to work in a workplace that goes against what's important to me. So that's great, yeah, shared values between what you feel is important and the university. You spend half your life there, so similarly, you want there to be zero carbon. Demonstration of the university's commitment, possibilities of cost savings and innovation. Yep, so an investment in the future. The size of the campus means we have a big impact, definitely. To contribute to a healthy world and future for our children. Yeah, again, looking forward to generations to come. That it's socially responsible, vital for our future, demonstrates our commitment on social and environmental justice, contribute to global need to reduce carbon emissions. Someone wanted to work for an institution that tackles the biggest issues facing our future, setting an example. So there's definitely themes here about the reputation and the university being an example for sort of doing the right thing here. Take care of the environment. We've got someone here that works in climate source science, doing our bit, being seen as being responsible, civic duty, not looking like a hypocrite, definitely, leading the way, reflecting our research expertise. So yeah, we've got a lot of themes here about everyone wants to work for this place, which does the right thing and is really sort of leading and innovative. So I'll just scroll down so everyone can see these last ones coming in, and then we'll move on to some question and answers. So while you're having a little think, if you put any questions you have in the chat, and then we can direct those to Richard or Sean, whoever would be best placed to respond. Got a lot of responses, thank you. Great, I'm going to close off the presentation now and hopefully come back for some questions. Great, we've got some coming in here. So the first one is, scroll up. Why has transport not been covered? I was amazed recently to learn an electric cargo bike uses 1/30 of the energy of a car. Richard, do you want to say anything about transport?
Yeah, will do. Hi, Emily. Thanks for the question, and thanks for all the others that are coming in. So it's a good question. It really comes down to that question about scopes again, and I appreciate someone else has made a point about scope 3 further down in the chat, which we might get time to get to. But the focus of this particular target, which is the same as everyone else who's aligned to this target, is that it's about scope 1 and 2. And without wanting to repeat what I said earlier on, transport, with the exception of fleet vehicles, which are vehicles where we burn the fuel in our own engines, effectively the engines that the university owns, transport is out of scope. So let's have a look. Matthew replied to that. Thank you, Matthew. I think he's basically replied really for me there. He said it would apply to the university's vehicle fleet, and it'd be interesting to know what possibilities there are for that. So yeah, so as with many things, I mean, I could talk for the full hour probably about any of these questions that you're posing, and I'm not going to do that because I want you to go and have some lunch, but we're looking into fleet vehicles as well. And I'll say this probably again several times throughout the rest of the session. When we have more detail that we can share, we will share it. But it's a good point. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Richard. So the next one from Andy is a good question. Why not start with energy procurement? It's essentially just a choice to be made to use a provider that uses 100% renewable, a quick win, while we work on the time-consuming aspects, and quick wins matter when considering the carbon budget. So yes, definitely, this is something we've been talking about, and maybe I might start with Sean on that one.
Yep, thanks, Harriet. Yeah, Andy, very good point. So what we described in the presentation was our assessment approach. So how we've started assessing the campus and how we're recommending different interventions at different times. It doesn't necessarily indicate the implementation timelines. So you're completely right. Energy procurement could be the first thing that you do because it might only take you 6 months to negotiate a contract. But when it comes to our kind of methodology, we always start with reduce emissions and then think about your consumption and how you deal with the energy sources after that. So yeah, you're right. That procurement stuff can happen really early on and at any point really in the timeline. I'll
chuck one thing into there, Sean, as well. We already buy our electricity with a so-called REGO attached to it. So a REGO, forgive me if I've got this wrong, but I believe it stands for Renewable Electricity Guarantee of Origin. I'm looking at Sean, hoping that he's nodding his head. Great, I've got a tick from Dr. Sean. So we're already buying so-called green electricity. Now, we could debate this all day, and obviously we can't do that. We're not for a moment saying that that is good enough. However, it is, at least in my view, better than buying what we describe as brown energy, which is energy which comes straight from the grid. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we're building any additionality into the grid in terms of renewables. So that's why we could go further. There are options to go further than just having electricity that comes with a REGO attached, and that's where you'd get into something called a power purchase agreement. But yeah, Sean's right. The order in which those things are presented and not necessarily the order in which things will be implemented.
Thanks both. Next good question from Claire. Is the shift to hybrid working affecting the decisions the team are making? And if so, how?
Gosh.
So go for Richard first and then see if Sean's got anything.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Very mindful of hybrid working. And I've had some contact with the hybrid working team, and I suspect that when zero carbon starts to become, the master plan, and by the way, it's a working title, right? Zero Carbon Master Plan. So next month it might be called something different, but that's what we've been calling it for the past year or so. I suspect as the notion of it becomes more widespread, I expect and hope that it will kind of encompass more and more different activities that the university does. To relate directly to hybrid working, there was an excellent methodology which was produced by a consultancy called EcoAct, which attempted to come up with a simple way in which any business can account for their working from home emissions, to see what the impact is. Because of course it doesn't mean that there aren't any emissions just because we're all working from home, because we're all gonna, I would imagine that most of us, if not all of us, are going to have heating on at some point during the winter, etc., etc. And how do you balance that out against commuter miles and the carbon that's attached to that? So a bit tricky to work that out, but I really, really want an answer to it. And I hope and expect that will feed into things. But I can't honestly, hand on heart, give you an answer as to whether or not the things that we're talking about now will be a key factor within hybrid working. I can't give you an answer to that.
Thanks, Rich. Sean, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in with one thing. So hybrid working, yes, very important. Richard mentioned about the associated emissions, potentially scope 3 from working from home. But from Siemens' point of view, what we're interested in most is how hybrid working affects the overall energy demand and therefore emissions. It's something that we've accounted for in our modelling of the site, and also something that we've accounted for in the interventions that we're proposing. So some of the things that we're suggesting are advanced space optimization. So how you can manage the flexible use of spaces. So if you have an office that's only part occupied, how can you monitor that and then manage the energy consumption associated with that office and how that space is used? So it's being considered in that regard moving forward.
Great, thank you. So we do have another one here on scope 3, basically highlighting the issue of the impact that, say, student travel, international travel would have on the carbon budget. So I think we have talked a bit about that, and maybe Richard, when we've got an update on how those scope 3 emissions are likely to be taken into account and what strategies are going to be implemented, we can share an update on that one.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Mindful of, I've not read all the questions. They're coming in too thick and fast for me to read while still trying to think of how I could answer them. But mindful of all these issues, mindful of the student travel issue as well. Certainly, this is not to divert action to further down the road. But the first thing we need to do is understand where we're starting from. So that will be part of our scope 3 assessment when we're working out our scope 3 footprint.
Thanks. So the next one from Katrina, I'll put this one to Sean. Are hydrogen boilers on the way?
Thanks, Harriet. Yeah, I think there's maybe 3 in a row here I can answer in one go.
Go for it.
Be efficient as possible. Yes, so hydrogen, yeah, you'll have read a lot about it in the news, etc. And there's recent government policy just last year about how they intend to expand the hydrogen industry in the UK. Hydrogen boilers are great in theory because it can be a clean energy source. So you can create hydrogen with electricity. So if you use green electricity, that is a green energy source, and it burns. It's hot. It's like almost an equivalent to gas or fossil fuels. But for space heating, it's very unlikely that we'll be using hydrogen boilers in future. So hydrogen, because the difficulties in creating it and using it as a heat source, is most likely to be used for very difficult to decarbonize industries. So things like shipping, heavy industry, etc. It's mainly going to be used for that. And there are limitations to the quantity that we can produce. So hydrogen boiler is great, yes, but probably not for space heating or home applications. At least that's what the current science is telling us. The question after, I think, just a bit of heat pump love. Yeah, heat pumps seem to be, or at least most people believe they're the best and most feasible solution for space heating. So they're the ones that the kind of star technology at the moment. And I think I've covered Nuala's comment as well about green hydrogen just after that.
Thanks, Sean. And sorry, Richard, did you want to say?
I was going to say, can I just chuck in one thing, which is a bit of a plug for the Sustainable Futures platform? I suspect a lot of you on here already know about it, but just in case you don't, gosh, can't remember when it was now. I think it was the autumn of last year. The university launched this Sustainable Futures platform, which I don't know the mission statement off the top of my head. Forgive me, Mike, if you're still listening. But as I understand it, it's basically attempting to draw together all the expertise that we have in these kind of topics from across the university, to celebrate the work that we're doing, and also to encourage cross-fertilization between faculties and departments as to how we can accelerate change and come up with better, different, more innovative solutions. And some of the more sciencey type comments that are being made, particularly perhaps in relation to hydrogen, which, to be honest, are going to be beyond my expertise to answer properly. Those are areas that you might want to explore in Sustainable Futures, and I'm sure they'd really welcome your input into that. So if you search for Sustainable Futures on StaffNet, or even I think actually just on Google, because it's an external facing website, then you'll be able to get stuck into that debate.
Thanks, Richard. We've got a good one on geothermal here. I'll put this one to Sean. So how is geothermal being considered in terms of the space limitations? So how much space would the deep geothermal take?
Yeah, great question. So we struggled with this one for a while. You're totally right. Very limited space availability for the campus, for the main site. But we did manage to find one site. So the geothermal plant itself doesn't take up much space. So it's only, I think, about 250 meters squared just for the plant. So when you get the heat from the ground and transfer it into a heat network. So that's okay, we can find that space. The challenge is the drilling and construction of that plant. You need a much, much larger area for that. I think it's about 8,000 meters squared from memory. We did manage to find a site, just one site on the campus where that could be possible. But yeah, it is a serious constraint and something that needs to be considered.
I guess just to add to that one, when we're talking about deep geothermal, we're talking about drilling 2 wells that go deep, potentially 4 kilometers down, which is a little different to some of the shallower geothermal where you would have less deep but more surface area. So we're talking about just 2 wells, which is a smaller area, but still not insignificant and difficult to find a suitable site.
Sorry, Harry, I'll just jump in on that one again, as I seem to be doing. Just want to stress with geothermal and with everything else that we've spoken about, right? Remember, these are at the moment, these are hypothetical things that we are exploring. So please don't get any hairs running and think, oh, any of this is definitely going to happen. Geothermal is definitely happening, whatever it may be. These are all options that are on the table that we need to consider as part of the best way of moving forwards at speed. So again, please don't start thinking that any of this is definitely the way that it's going to go, or I've heard this or I've heard that, because what we're trying to give you is a flavour of the things that we're exploring. So sorry if that sounds like a rather political kind of statement to make. Just want to kind of stress it.
Thanks, Richard. We've got a reference to a paper there that looks a great one to go and find out more about the expertise that the university has on that. One for Richard here. How can the university help individual departments to environmentally assess their day-to-day processes? So printing versus online and so on.
Gosh, that's a good question. The answer is really, it's really, really hard. So we know what the consumption is of the buildings, and therefore we know what the carbon footprint is of the buildings. But when you get down to a departmental level, it's really, really tricky. If different departments or even different faculties are spread across different buildings, then trying to apportion the carbon to individual teams is really, really hard. Okay, and I think there's a danger that we actually end up spending too much time trying to measure and not enough time on the action. So I think I'm probably going to say in response to that one, that don't let the quest for the perfect measurement get in the way of action. And in terms of things like specifics, like one that comes up quite a bit, it's really used to my old job, is hand dryers versus versus paper towels and things like that. They can be a bit of a rabbit hole. Just as I've raised that one, I'm going to say that the hand dryer, an efficient hand dryer, is better than a towel, a paper towel. I don't know why that one popped into my head. I mean, let's be clear. This is very far from being the most important issue that the university's got to deal with. Yeah, don't let the measurement get in the way of the action. But if any of you do want more specific help, please get in touch with the team at the email address, which is going to be on the chat somewhere, and we'll do our best to help. We're not going to turn anyone away.
Great, thanks, Richard. One for Sean here. So this question's around, can you give a sense of proportion of change that can come from the different master plan areas? So roughly, what are we talking in terms of the efficiencies and the heat in terms of reducing those carbon emissions? And that was from Andrew.
So I can't give you specifics right now, but in our report, all of that will be included. So the way we've done it is proposed number of different interventions and the carbon reductions that happen from those interventions. And importantly as well, what usually happens is that there'll be a zero carbon commitment by a certain date by an organisation. So you just have individual interventions that get you to that date. Now, the University of Manchester's budget or target is far more thorough. So you have a total budget up to 2038. So it's less important about the reductions of individual interventions. What's really important is how everything can happen together at the same time. So you might be doing multiple things in the same year or even do it in the same month that will affect your overall emissions. Very difficult to monitor and track and measure the change from an individual intervention, but the most important thing is that you stay within that budget. And with our model, that's what we've done. So we've just proposed all the different interventions at different times and seen how they work together to let you stick within your budget.
Thanks, Sean. I'll skip down. I won't do everyone, but if we miss any questions out that are maybe we've talked on the topic, we'll make sure we get all written responses out to these afterwards. So to Richard, does the Tyndall analysis take any account of the historic emissions from Manchester?
Oh gosh, I think the answer to that is no. The baseline year was 2018, so I think it's moving forwards from that point and saying how much carbon can we emit from that point onwards to stay within 1.5. That's the theory behind it. If anyone here is from Tyndall and knows any different or better than me, then please write something in the chat or speak up. But I'll try and get a better answer for you than that.
I'm just scrolling through to pick up a few more. So can double glazing be installed in some buildings to reduce heat loss, Sean?
Definitely, that's one of the things we'd be recommending under the building fabric retrofits. So it's about insulation, it's about your walls and your ceilings and your roofs, but it's also about windows. And an important aspect is not just the heat transfer, so the heat loss through the window, but also air leakage. If you have old, maybe single glazed windows, they might be very drafty, and that's a serious source of heat loss as well. So yeah, we'll be recommending that.
And another one for Sean from Paul. Battery energy storage is now being seen as a viable subsidy-free investment opportunity. Is the university looking at this? So what considerations have we made towards battery energy storage?
Yes, very good point about batteries. It's not being considered at the university for a number of reasons. So your electricity demand is very high. So any renewable generation that you have on site, so if you have a solar array, for example, will be being consumed. So there's no requirement really for renewable energy storage. So that's one reason. And the other reason, so sometimes what you can do is, if you're looking at the grid electricity supply, the carbon factor of the grid will change over time, depending on how much renewable generation there is throughout the country. But because all of your energy supply will be coming from this renewable energy power purchase agreement, your emissions are effectively zero. So there isn't a benefit in terms of carbon for batteries on site. So that's why they haven't been considered. Thanks,
Sean. We're going to wrap up at 10:02, so I just have one more question. So there's one here from Debbie, and I'll put this one to Richard. So what are we looking at collaborating with other organizations, so MMU or other large organizations? So here the comment picks out that MMU consistently ranks higher on university green leagues, and it would be great to see collaborative work across local institutions.
Yeah, I'll take that. Hi, Debbie. Thanks for the question. So yeah, it's a good point. We're involved in a lot of partnerships, too many to actually list here, but I can certainly think of, we're part of the Oxford Road Corridor. We're part of the climate groups that are across the city. So we'll collaborate wherever we can and wherever it's appropriate and where it will help achieve what we want to achieve. I think I'm not going to go into too much detail on the university thing, but I'm certainly aware that MMU do very well on the Green League, and good for them. And I'm really, it's fantastic. And I talk to my counterpart there often. I hope that we'll start to rise up the ranks. Last year was a difficult year for us for obvious reasons within the environment team. But I'm hoping that things will start to go upwards. So I hope that we would rise up that league as well. But I always have to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons, and it's not just so that we can tick a box on a league table.
Thanks, Richard. And I know there's been a few requests for email contact, so we'll make sure that in the chat we have Richard's email, so you can get in contact with him. And the main the environmental mailbox might be better.
Yeah, I think so. That might help me out a little bit, Harriet.
Perfect. Well, you can personally share that with the group here. But yeah, Richard, over to you for. Thanks, Lucy. Is in there. es@manchester.ac.uk. So, Richard, if you just want to do your final close, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Harriet. So I just want to say thanks to everyone who's attended this call. I think the fact that we've had over 100 people on it, and the dropout rate usually for these things is quite high. We actually were discussing amongst ourselves before we started how many people would come, and I think it's pretty much exceeded our expectations. So I'm really, really grateful that people are so interested that they want to spend their time at lunch listening to this. I'm very grateful to Sean from Siemens for sharing his expertise, and for Harriet for organising it and being such a brilliant kind of compare, and the team who've supported us as well. Most importantly, though, I need to say, again, we talked a lot about kind of hypothetical things here. Things are going to happen. I don't know what order they're going to happen in or when, but I want you to be reassured that this is a matter that me and my team take incredibly seriously. I spend a great deal of my I spend all of my working hours and the majority of my waking hours thinking about this. So please have some confidence in that. But that doesn't mean that we should be having a comfort blanket and thinking that everything is all sorted and everything. You need to keep talking to me. I'll keep talking to you, and I hope that you'll hear more detail as and when it's ready. But for now, thanks ever so much for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Okay, I think we're wrapping up, so I'll see you later, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.